What are some of the key characteristics of Mark's Gospel? One key characteristic is its structure. Mark's Gospel can be divided into two sections. In the first section, the hiddenness of Jesus as Messiah emphasized. At the start of this section, Jesus tells the demons and unclean spirits not to talk about him as the Messiah. In Mark chapter 1 verses 21 to 26, we read about Jesus telling the unclean spirit to keep quiet. A little bit further along, we find the reason why Jesus commanded them to keep quiet was because they knew him. This is repeated in chapter 3 verses 11 and 12. But Jesus doesn't just tell the demons to keep quiet. He also tells people to hold back. In Mark chapter 1 verses 40 to 44, we find a man is healed. Jesus tells him not to tell anybody about it. Also in chapter 4 verses 33 and 34, we read how Jesus gave one teaching in public. But for his disciples in private, he gave the full version of the teaching. Again in chapter 8 verses 11 to 13, we read the Pharisees were looking for a sign. For what kind of sign were they looking? Probably some kind of sign to assure them that Jesus was the Messiah. However, Jesus gave them no sign. This first section culminates in the declaration by Peter that Jesus is the Christ in chapter 8 verse 27 to 30. However, even at this declaration, Jesus tells the disciples not to tell anybody who is he. From this point on, the gospel is about the fullness of Jesus' person and mission, which climaxes in his death and resurrection on the cross. We read in 8:31 that Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. It is only after we understand the death and resurrection of Jesus can we fully understand who Jesus is and what he came to do. So the second section of Mark is about revealing the Messiah, which is completed by his death and resurrection. We see this particularly in chapter 9, verse 9, where Jesus tells his disciples not to speak of his transfiguration until his death and resurrection. Another characteristic of Mark's Gospel is its fast pace. It is the shortest Gospel in terms of words. There is little in the way of introduction, it gets straight into action. The first verse might be something of a title, but after that it gets straight into the action. John just appears in the wilderness. There are no childhood stories about Jesus or John. There are no prophecies about this is going to happen, and then they happen. Things just happen. John appears baptizing. Then Jesus appears and is baptized. Then what happens? Mark chapter 1 verses 12 says that the Spirit immediately drove Jesus into the wilderness. This verse is the first of many where the word immediately appears. Things happen quickly in this gospel. After one bit of action finishes, the next immediately happens. In the original version, the word immediately appears 8 times in chapter 1 verses 10 to 30, and 40 times in the whole book. Although some versions smooth over the word to make it more readable. And yet, while the gospel is shorter and fast-paced, there are often more details than in other gospels. Sometimes this means a longer version of the story. Like in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. This is also seen in the example of Jesus being tested in the wilderness. Matthew's version of this event is longer. There are some details in Mark not in Matthew, such as the beasts being with Jesus. Another characteristic of Mark's Gospel is the disputed ending. Unfortunately, when this book was written, it wasn't saved in the cloud for all time so that we could know exactly what Mark wrote. The Gospel was written and passed on to people. It was copied by some and then given to others. Over hundreds of years, the Gospel was hand-copied many hundreds of times. Each time someone makes a copy of the old, they are prone to making a mistake. Sometimes these mistakes are small and sometimes they are large. It is easy to miss a whole line of text if the first word of the two lines are the same. But many of the mistakes can be seen by collecting a large number of copies and seeing what is there. Sometimes, however, people have to guess between two options, and you can see that in Bibles with the footnotes. For example, in Acts chapter 12 verse 25, the NRSV says, "Then after completing their mission, Barnabas and Saul returned to Jerusalem and brought with them John, whose other name was Mark." In the footnotes it says, "Other ancient authorities read from." It makes more sense for it to read them returned from Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 11 verses 29 and 30, the church in Antioch sends Paul and Barnabas down to Jerusalem. Mark lives in Jerusalem and they bring him with them. They return to where? Probably Antioch from Jerusalem. But there is confusion because different copies say different things. In the earliest versions of Mark's Gospel, the end is shorter. If we look at Mark chapter 16 version 9, different Bibles say different things about this being the longer ending. I don't know why this is so. It may be because on some of the earliest versions the end of the paper or scroll was lost. But some suggest that Mark or someone else added the ending on later. It is likely that Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels, and so for me it makes sense that initially there wasn't such a long ending. And that the longer ending was added on later, or make it more like other Gospels. Does it make a big difference? Some people think so. But from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke we have similar information.